I know that it is only year one in the Matt Rhule era. And I also know that many things you will hear in this video are things that you heard in past Nebraska videos about predictions and reasons for optimism in the 2022 season. I know that. In 2022, in fact, as many of you Cornhuskers know, and as many of you college football fans who have watched this channel know, I had Nebraska going 10-2, winning the Big Ten West, Scott Frost, or maybe Ryan Day, but likely Scott Frost getting Coach of the Year. I had Nebraska as a top 15, top 10 team, and going 10-2. I definitely had them losing in Indy, but then they could have went 10-4 or 11-3 if they lost or won their bowl game in those scenarios. That was my prediction for Nebraska. And they fell dramatically short. In a scenario where I predicted them to possibly get 4 losses, if they lost in Indy and lost their bowl game, they only got 4 wins in the regular season. They beat North Dakota. They beat Rutgers. They beat Indiana. They beat Iowa on the road, which, by the way, makes my prediction last year even funnier because one of the only 2 regular season losses I had for the Huskers was at Iowa on the road. Everything went the opposite that I thought for Nebraska last year. But that doesn't mean the reasons for optimism weren't justified to a certain degree. Nebraska had a top 10 incoming transfer portal class. They hired a hot coordinator in Mark Whipple, who developed Kenny Pickett into an NFL QB who's starting for the Pittsburgh Steelers. They brought in Trey Palmer from LSU, who proved to be one of the nation's best wide receivers. They brought in Marcus Washington and Casey Thompson from Texas, not campus. They brought in Anthony Grant from New Mexico Military Institute, a running back who nearly got 1,000 rushing yards. And they had a lot of returning production on defense in a lot of key areas. They had Garrett Nelson coming back, Luke Reimer and Nick Henrich returning. They brought in Ochon Mathis and Tommy Hill, guys who were big-bodied and had a lot of potential despite their limited playing time at times. Mathis was a huge success. Tommy Hill had to switch to wide receiver because he was not good at corner. There were a lot of reasons for optimism last year. Unfortunately, none of them came through. We can attribute that, I think, to the fact that Scott Frost did not make the changes in himself that he needed to make. He was not a good leader. The same excuses that he made from 2018 to 2021 continued. They compounded upon themselves, and after losing to Clay Helton and Georgia Southern at home, you knew the minute the clock hit 0 and Frankie missed that field goal, the way Scott Frost took off his headset, he knew he was going to be fired. And indeed, the following day, he was canned. And Trev Alberts decided to spend nearly an extra $8 million to kick him out 3 weeks early. That's how badly they wanted him out of Nebraska. So, look, my prediction last year on Nebraska was way off. I feel like I have to be honest about that. But it's a prediction. Everyone has their predictions and speculations they get wrong. So I'm mentioning that just to mention it. But moving forward, I think Nebraska still carries a lot of that same optimism and potential power. I think they do. I said at many different times that I think Nebraska, is a 7 or 8 win team this year in the Big Ten. Maybe 6 wins. I think they go bowling under Matt Rhule in his first year at Nebraska. And the 6, 7, or 8 wins includes their bowl game. So I think 6-7, 7-5, 8-5 is likely what you are going to get in year one. And again, this is for now. After spring ball, after the spring games, after the second cycle of the transfer portal is mostly concluded, and depending on injuries of other teams or injuries for Nebraska or lack thereof, or, other things, maybe the predictions will change. But for now, I think Nebraska's a team that's going to be middle of the road in the Big Ten West. They'll go bowling. I think that the defense are going to have to build completely from the foundation up. Eric Chenander, whatever illusions I had about him being a great defensive coordinator were ruined after he failed to build a cohesive defense with the likes of Garrett Nelson, Luke Reimer, Nick Henrich, Ochon Mathis, a decent D-tackle room, and a corner and safety room that, look, lost a good amount of production, but you got an FCS All-American or near All-American FCS player in a guy from Northern Iowa whose name escaped me who came in. I think Omar Brown. Tommy Hill, who was a big-bodied, high-ceiling corner, and development didn't happen, and schematics were horrendous. So I think the defense needs to be built from the bottom up, especially seeing that Mathis and Nelson are both gone. And I think that the staff at Nebraska realizes this too, as MJ Sherman, for example, is coming over from Georgia. And there are a lot of transfer portal players who are coming in to fill on defense. Corey Collier is another one of these players, cornerback formerly from Florida. The offense, on the other hand, and this is where I think I'm going to start off with giving some reasons for success. I'll get to that more in a few minutes, but these are more things that I think Nebraska can achieve. These aren't facts. These are just predictions that might be a little out there, but I think are possible. But I'm not saying they're going to happen. I think Nebraska can have one of the Big Ten's most efficient and productive offenses. You have Casey Thompson returning. He had a 150 passer rating last year. He averaged 8.8, nearly 9 yards per pass attempt. 70th in passing yards, 66th in passing touchdowns, 91st in interceptions. That was his worst category, was turnovers. We saw this to a certain degree with Texas. High ceiling, low floor kind of player. But he had a much worse supporting cast with Nebraska than he did with Texas. Worse wide receiver core overall, though Trey Palmer, I'd say, Trey Palmer was one of the best wide receivers in the nation. But outside of him and Marcus Washington, didn't have many playmakers at wide receiver. Maybe Alante Brown here and there, but still. Texas had a better wide receiver room. Texas had a much better O-line, much better running back in Bijan Robinson, much better play caller, too, in Steve Sarkisian compared to Mark Whipple. And he still had a 150 passer rating. He still completed 63% of his passes. And with his porous O-line, which allowed 24 sacks on him, he was only able to play in 10 games. And he wasn't even healthy in all of those 10 games. There were points where he left those games with injury, or he, got subbed in for Chubba Purdy because the defense was so bad that they didn't want to risk his health for just getting style points when getting blown up by the likes of Oklahoma, let's say. But Casey Thompson's back. I think he's one of the Big Ten's best quarterbacks. And Anthony Grant is also returning along with A.J. Allen. That's a very underrated running back room because Anthony Grant and A.J. Allen, they averaged over 4 yards per carry. They had one of the nation's worst offensive lines. We've seen flashes of them where they've broken tackles, found holes where there aren't any. And you also got Ramir Johnson there as well in the running back room. Very underrated running back room. Jeff Sims is being added from the transfer portal. Athletic quarterback, bad system at Georgia Tech. I guarantee you with a better supporting cast here at Nebraska. Jeff Sims, Logan Smothers, Casey Thompson, that'll be a quarterback room that I think Matt Rhule and Marcus Satterfield will be able to develop, hone the talents there. And then at tight end with Thomas Fedone, Chris Hickman, Arik Gilbert, Nate Borgacher, you have talent at tight end. A lot of returning players there in a transfer portal addition. Vokalek is gone, which is unfortunate. On offensive line, Turner Corcoran returns. Noradin Newell comes back after being suspended for PED testing. Teddy Prohaska's back at tackle. Bryce Benhart's back at tackle. Players that were pretty bad, but Donovan Raiola's going to be in year 2 as an offensive line coach. Maybe some, lack of staff turnover there will help with the development of the O-line, but that's a very, very questionable position. And then at wide receiver, Marcus Washington, Alante Brown, they return. Xavier Betts is back at the program. Same with Isaiah Garcia, Castaneda, and Joshua Fleeks and Billy Kemp are coming in from the portal. I think all of that talent on offense with Marcus Satterfield as coordinator gives hope. and with Matt Rhule as head coach as well. There is a lot of reason for optimism for Nebraska's offense. The defense, on the other hand, we're not going to touch up on this because this isn't a reason for success. I think the defense has the potential to be one of the worst, if not possibly the worst, when it comes to talent efficiency in the Big Ten. Just because of how busted it is from a playmaking standpoint. It would have nothing to do with who Tony White is as a coordinator, just all the departing production and the fact that I think Erik Chinander, to a certain degree, did leave the cupboard bare in some cases. One last thing, and then we'll get to some facts that I want to talk about. Nebraska does, I think, have the potential to win the Big Ten West. Now, do I think they will? At this current moment, no. But you don't have Oklahoma on your schedule. You don't have Ohio State. Now, Oklahoma last year was bad, but you have Colorado as your Power 5 non-conference opponent. Colorado. Now, I know it's Deion Sanders. I know they have the number 1 transfer portal class. It's going to take more than a year for Colorado to be a good football program. Nebraska's toughest game is hosting Michigan and probably traveling on the road to Wisconsin after that, or Minnesota. Hosting Michigan's tough, as I think Michigan's going to win the national championship. Wisconsin or Iowa is going to win the Big Ten West, in my opinion, but Iowa was beatable last year. I'd say they're beatable again from a matchup perspective. The fact that Nebraska has a really good offense to pair with a really good defense of Iowa's, and the inverse is true as well, except the offense for Iowa's bad and the defense for Nebraska's bad, kind of evens the playing field when these two teams play. On the road at Wisconsin's going to suck too, but Nebraska, they host Northern Illinois, Louisiana Tech, Northwestern, Purdue, Maryland, Iowa. Those are their home games. They could realistically win all of those games outside of the Michigan game, which is also a home game. They have road games at Minnesota, Colorado, Illinois, Michigan State, and Wisconsin. I think they could realistically win all of them now. Will they win all 5 in a given year? I don't think so, but none of those games, I would say, is a guaranteed loss. And when you look at it, as long as they beat everyone except for maybe they lose to Wisconsin on the road, they lose to Michigan at home, and maybe they drop a road game at Colorado or lose to Minnesota, they could go 6-3, and with the chaos that the Big Ten West has been over the past 2 years, they could find themselves in position to going to Indy. Or maybe they could go 7-2. They do really well in a bad Big Ten West. Maybe they, 9-3 or 8-4. They mess the bet against a bad non-conference opponent, lose 2 or 3 conference games, and they find themselves in Indy. I think it's very possible given the schedule, given the fact that their toughest game is against someone who's out of their division in Michigan, and they don't play Ohio State and Michigan in the same year. I don't expect Michigan State to be a top 10 team. The only top 10 teams that I see on Nebraska's schedule is Michigan, potentially Wisconsin. If you really, really want to stretch it, maybe Iowa, maybe Michigan State have that potential. But I'd say Michigan's the only team for sure that's going to be top 10 on Nebraska's schedule, maybe Wisconsin. So a doable schedule, an offense that could be one of the Big Ten's best. That's exciting. That's cause for optimism. Here are 3 exciting facts for Nebraska. They're 4th in the Big Ten in returning production, number 39 nationally, and they return several skill players. Alante Brown, Marcus Washington at wide receiver, Casey Thompson at quarterback, Anthony Grant, A.J. Allen, Ramir Johnson at running back. They return a slew of skill position players. A lot of them. And at the offensive line, which is not considered skill position, they do have returning production there. Now, similarly to, let's say, Michigan State secondary, when they returned a lot of production in 2022 after a bad 2021 year, that's not necessarily always going to be a great thing if you return a lot of production on a unit that didn't have much production. But who knows at the same time? Michigan State secondary, it wasn't a given that they were going to be bad. Again, it was likely, but you don't know. So where you can get returning production at a specific unit and you think that they can improve, that's something that you got to be considerate of and thankful of. But for skill position especially, I want to emphasize that. Anthony Grant was 54th in the country in rushing yards with 915, 6 rushing touchdowns. He averaged 4.2 yards per carry. He also had 100 receiving yards. He faced Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota. I mean, that right there, the 5-game stretch from late October, the 29th, through November, he faced defenses that all resided in the top 20. I think, in scoring and I think in total defense as well, but I'd have to double check with that. I care more about scoring defense than total defense, so I do a lot more research on scoring defense and defensive efficiency than I do just yards allowed. Because yards allowed is more of a deceiving stat, in my opinion. Still valuable, but can be deceiving. You take Wisconsin out of the picture, Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa were all top 10 in scoring. He faced some brutal defenses. He still managed to average 5.1 and 5.5 yards per carry against Illinois and Minnesota, respectively. Against Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, he only averaged 2 yards per carry or less. I don't know if there was an injury going on there or if the defenses just happened to play much better against Grant than Minnesota and Illinois did, or maybe the offensive line wasn't playing as well. I don't exactly remember. All I remember is that against Iowa, the run game for Nebraska, at least from Anthony Grant, was almost a non-factor. And it was mainly Casey Thompson and his wide receiver core, and Marcus Washington and Trey Palmer just shredding one of the best secondaries in the nation. Granted, part of it was because Cooper DeJean went down with an injury, but still, at the same time, it was impressive nonetheless. And a lot of that skill position group, not Trey Palmer, but the quarterback, some of the wide receivers, running back Ramir Johnson, who played decently in that Iowa game, and a lot of the offensive linemen, too, who helped. They helped Nebraska beat the Hawkeyes for the first time in over half a decade. They're coming back. So this offense can, with proper coaching, with the returning production they have, do well and push Big Ten defenses to their limit. The Huskers once again have a top 25 transfer portal class, and quarterback, wide receiver, offensive line, and defensive line are the areas where I look at and I see the most reinforcement. They brought in Jeff Sims from the portal. They brought in Billy Kemp from the portal. Isaiah Garcia Castaneda entered the portal. He announced his return to Nebraska, and Josh Fleeks is coming in from Baylor. Nebraska also is reinforcing at D-line with Elijah Judy, linebacker with Chief Borders, secondary with Corey Collier, defensive line / linebacker because edge has really become this hybrid position. It's no longer just defensive end, it's edge. MJ Sherman coming in from Georgia, nearly a 5-star prospect out of high school, now rated as a 3-star. You got Jacob Hood and Ben Scott coming in from Georgia and Arizona State, respectively, to reinforce the offensive line at the tackle position. There is just a lot. There's a lot of guys coming in. Nebraska is ranked top 25 in the transfer portal class, 23rd. Unfortunately, the Huskers, through the transfer portal, also lost a lot of great players. Ernst Hausmann being one of them. DeColdis Crawford left. Hausmann, of course, went to Michigan, where he's now enrolled. DeColdis Crawford is at Louisiana Tech. Jaden Gould, the highest-ranked prospect for Nebraska in the 2022 class, transferred to Syracuse to be alongside of his former secondary coach, Travis Fisher, who left to take the job at Syracuse as their secondary coach. So there is a lot of guys that are coming in for Nebraska. A lot of different players coming in for the Huskers to help out, to help rebuild this team, to help retool it, to get Nebraska where Matt Rhule wants to get it. And believe me, with the portal, there's going to be a lot less patience and a lot more pressure on Matt Rhule and his staff to fix what Mike Riley and Scott Frost could not fix. And finally, speaking of the staff and speaking of Matt Rhule, Rhule has assembled a staff that develops schemes and recruits at a championship contending level. And by championship contending, I mean Big Ten championship contending. Nebraska has a long way to go before I even consider that Matt Rhule could contend for a national title. I'm not even going to entertain that. But Nebraska has not won a conference championship in a decade. Not a decade, more. It's more than 2 decades is what I meant to say. I was going to say more than 2 decades, then for some reason, a decade is what came out. But more than 2 decades it has been since Nebraska won a national title. It's been a decade since Nebraska played for a conference championship when they played in the 2012 Big Ten championship game, and Nebraska basically allowed Wisconsin to rush for 400 or 500 yards on them. Monte Ball, James White, Melvin Gordon. Yeah, I think Wisconsin's running back had a better passing game from trick plays than their own quarterback did. It was a crazy game. But Rhule has assembled a staff that, look, they're contending for Dylan Raiola at quarterback, 5-star prospect. They're on the board of a lot of 4 and other 5-star prospects too, and if they land Raiola, that's going to create a ripple effect in recruiting. Schematically, Tony White bringing the 3-3-5 to Nebraska, I love it. The 3-3-5, the 4-2-5, the 3-2-6, those are the defenses of the future. They're going to counteract the spreads that the Big Ten is slowly adopting, and they also match up well against some of the antiquated offenses that, like, let's say Iowa runs, for example, and many other teams. So these modern defenses, the modern schemes that his staff is bringing to Nebraska, very good things. I don't think bringing in the 3-3-5 or bringing in, the kind of spread and the kind of offense that Matt Rhule and Marcus Satterfield want to run, I don't think it's a situation like with what's happening with Frost, where he's bringing in non-Power 5 coordinators, and he's bringing, Frost brought an offense that really, it was unique, and it could only work in unique circumstances with unique players. And he didn't have those circumstances going his way in the Big Ten West. He just didn't. And he couldn't because he tried using Mike Riley's players with that system, and it just didn't work. And it wrecked him, it wrecked Nebraska, but I don't think that's what's going on here. He's bringing in Power 5 proven coordinators from day one. He's not waiting until year 5 to do it when it's already too late, like Frosty the Snowman did. So there's a lot of reasons for optimism. There's a lot of facts that I think support at least the reasons for optimism. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. The games have to play themselves. Every given Saturday, different things can happen. And yes, I can totally see a scenario in which Nebraska doesn't go bowling again, because the job that Matt Rhule has here is a tough one. It's going to be a tough rebuild, but I think in year 1, I think Nebraska is going to see a bowl game. And in year 1, if enough things go their way, if they get some bounces that go their way, if they are the most efficient they can be, and the Big Ten West is chaotic, they might even win the division, and I might have been a year too early. Thank you all for watching. If you're new to the channel, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment your thoughts on Nebraska football down below. Thank you guys for watching and sticking around until the end. I'll see you guys later. Bye.